Hi, everyone. My name is Khushboo Chabria. I'm calling in from Neurodiversity Pathways, and we are a small organization, part of Goodwill of Silicon Valley, here in the Bay Area of California. And I'll tell you a little bit about who we are, as well as a little bit about myself. We are a small program that's focused on supporting neurodivergent people be intentionally included in the workplace. We do this through two different ways. We actually work with neurodivergent job seekers, so people with autism, ADHD, dyslexia, etc., to help them get the workplace readiness skills in order to be prepared for the workplace. And that includes all things from growth mindset, 7 habits, executive function, coping and resilience, as well as job development skills such as understanding yourself, understanding your strengths, understanding what opportunities would be a good fit for you depending on your strengths and differences, as well as looking at how to brand yourself as a professional, how to build out your resume, your cover letter, as well as your LinkedIn profile. Also, learning how to interview as a neurodivergent person. And also, in addition to that, we teach things like assertive communication, conflict resolution, team structure and dynamics, and powerful presentations. After all of this teaching, our job seekers actually go through a 2-week process where they learn how to do project work in teams. And then we provide one-on-one coaching to those who are eligible in order to help them get placed into full-time jobs. Obviously, as professionals, we recognize that in trying to get more neurodivergent people employed, we kind of need to work on both sides of the situation. So we also work with companies, whether they're startups, nonprofits, larger organizations, and corporations, to teach them how we can support neurodivergent people in the workplace. A little bit about who I am. My name is Khushboo Chabria. I have been a clinician. I have worked in school districts. I have worked in in-home therapy. I've worked in social skills groups. I've also attempted to start a dating program for neurodivergent youth. I've worked with parents to start a parent training program. And most recently, my team and I actually released this book called Neurodiversity for Dummies, in which we hope to empower neurodivergent people and all the people who support them in order to thrive. So a little bit about neurodiversity, some of you may have heard the term, some of you may not at Autism Connect. So I'll explain a little bit, just like how all of us in society look different, speak differently, maybe we have different hair color, maybe we're different heights, maybe we have different eye color, whatever that may be, this diversity is pretty much accepted as completely normal. And this is a normal part of our society. And just like that, we can't assume that all of our brains are the same either. And, with our brains, all of us have different ways that our brains work. And what that shows up as what we can see is different behaviors, maybe different ways of communicating, different social skills, different ways of working, different ways of making sense of the world. And all of these things are really very important. One of the things that we talk about very much at Neurodiversity Pathways is the concept that neurodiversity is normal. People who are neurodivergent, such as people with autism, ADHD, dyslexia, etc., are in all areas of our society, and they have always been there. Thankfully, now in our world today, we know so much more about neurodiversity. We know better ways to support children with autism, children with ADHD, children with dyslexia, as well as young adults. But one thing that's definitely something that we do need to focus on is what happens when these kids grow up and go into the world trying to find a job. And unfortunately, the way that our systems in society are built can be very rigid and very structured, meaning we kind of look at people through some set rubric where we expect people to behave in certain ways and speak in certain ways. And unfortunately, that does end up affecting the employment of neurodivergent people. The most recent statistic that we have, which hasn't changed in a long time, is that only 18% of autistic adults have paid employment in a community integrated setting. And that's a very, very, very low percentage. What that essentially tells us that these individuals are essentially, going through high school, going through college, and even though most of them have average or above average intelligence, they are not getting into the jobs that they are qualified for or that they might have the experiences and skills for. And that's sort of where our program comes in order to support neurodivergent people. And what we're looking for are obviously people who have been working or have been working, but not really sort of getting anywhere with their employment, or people who've been jumping from job to job, or even those who have never had a job before and are just coming out of college. One of the things that we like to talk about at Neurodiversity Pathways is the importance of neurodivergent adults really understanding who they are on a deep level. And that starts with teaching our kids, right? Being able to understand how they are different, what their strengths are, what they're good at, what they're not good at. And these are some things that we need to start talking to our neurodivergent children way, way, way early in advance. We need to teach them, how to sort of navigate this neurotypical world, and also how to sort of get their needs met so that they are able to advocate for themselves. They're able to say what it is that they need. They're able to state their preferences, and they're able to communicate clearly to be able to say, no matter what environment they're in, I need this, I want this. When you're at home, being able to say, I need a break, or I need 5 more minutes. When you're in school, being able to say, I need an accommodation for extra test taking time, or I would really appreciate it if I could be seated in a certain part of the classroom because it helps me focus better. Similarly, as neurodivergent adults enter the workplace, they also kind of need to understand how to advocate for themselves in that new environment. So that's being able to say to your manager, I need extra time to process things, or is it possible for you to assign me projects in writing via email? Is it possible for you to call on me during meetings so that I know when I can speak up? And there's a lot of different reasons why these things happen. One is that neurodivergent people are just different. We like to tell people that we don't want to look at it from a medical model in terms of, we're not looking at something as a disorder or a syndrome or something that needs to be fixed, but rather it is something that we just kind of need to accept. And we need to sort of create spaces where those people's strengths can shine, and also include them for their differences. And that's something that we very, very much believe in. And the way to do that, there are many different ways, but one principle that we believe in very, very, very much is the concept of compassionate curiosity. And all that is essentially getting curious and asking people why they did something a certain way and trying to understand where they're coming from. So, for example, if you were working with a child, being able to say, hey, I understood that, maybe you weren't expecting this change that we had in our schedule, but I noticed that you did this instead of this when you normally do another thing. And usually kids will be pretty good at telling you, well, actually, the reason why I did this is because I was expecting this thing and this thing happened, or I got scared, or I was not sure what to do. And that's kind of where the learning happens. And similarly, we need to do that as well with older neurodivergent people. So with compassionate curiosity, you want to have compassion for the other person's experience. We all know that children with autism experience the world in a really, really different way than the rest of us. And being able to ask them to explain, why they may have done something if they are speaking, can be a great way for all of us to understand each other better. Similarly, if someone is not speaking, if they do have an assistive communication device or sign language, being able to use that to figure out ways to better understand our children. As adults, it's really helpful to be able to say, if you were speaking to an adult with autism, for example, one of the things that I do in my coaching calls is I ask a lot of questions to try to understand my clients. So I might say things like, can you explain to me, what you're thinking right now? Can you explain to me how you would go about this step by step? Can you repeat to me what we just talked about? Do you have any questions? What are your concerns right now? And having that curiosity to try to understand another person can go a very, very, very long way. And it can really help sort of bridge the gap that we have between people who are neurodivergent, such as people with autism, ADHD, dyslexia, bipolar disorder, and Tourette's, versus the rest of us who we call neurotypical. I mean, all of us are neurodiverse in terms of we're part of that diversity, but some of us just have different ways in which we really talk, in which the ways that we function, as well as the way that we understand the world around us. And when kids are growing up, there's a lot of different therapies that we have in place where we talk to all the differences that these children have and helping them sort of overcome those obstacles so that they can better communicate with the people around them. They can have better social skills. They can have executive functioning strategies that they can use to get things done, whether that's visual schedules, whether that's routines, using timers, as well as sort of understanding how to break down tasks and get things completed step by step. We also have things like cognition and sensory sensitivities. And with cognition, a lot of our children are very literal in how they understand things. So with children, one of the things that I found as a clinician very often is, kind of speaking to telling children, to do something and having them say in response, why are we doing this? Children with autism, children with ADHD need a lot of context, and they're very literal in how they understand things. So being able to give them a little bit more context and saying, what I really meant is this, and what I'm really asking is this, and for these reasons. With sensory sensitivities, obviously we all know that people with autism have a lot of differences in how they sense the world around them, as well as stimming, which is something that they need to do in order to process all that sensory information that they're receiving from the world. With children, this can be a lot of different things. They could be sensitive to certain types of clothing, certain types of sound. And whether we're talking about children with autism or whether we're talking about adults with autism, these are all things that we need to think about as these children are going into the workplace. For example, I've worked with an adult who essentially had a sensory sensitivity where he did not like the sensation of the AC air on his hands. And for that reason, he had to wear gloves when he was working. And that's something that his workplace could easily accommodate by just saying, this person who's an employee prefers to wear gloves when they're working. And that's something that they need to think about in terms of, you know, understanding yourself as a neurodivergent person. That's kind of the best way to start if you're really trying to figure out what are some good career options. I see some questions here about career options. And one of the things that we like to tell our students is for you to find a good fit work environment. One, really thinking through what are some things that your child might have strengths in. So if we're talking about children, for example, someone who's 12, really looking at what they're very, very, very good at. A lot of times parents don't realize this, but some of those things that your kids are passionate about can absolutely turn into careers. A lot of people don't know this, but Satoshi Tajiri, who's actually the inventor of Pokemon, was someone who, as a child, you used to collect bugs and create worlds of creatures where he used to collect bugs, he used to sort them, he used to pin them, he used to identify them into families. And that passion of his actually led him to creating the whole Pokemon franchise and really thinking through, what is my child good at? What are some of their strengths? What are opportunities that would align with them in terms of how they like to work or what work environment would be good for them? Some people like to work independently. Some people do really, really well in teams, thinking through those kinds of things. Some people prefer, being in their own space and working in an office environment or going to another place to work might be very challenging for them. So when I work with our students that are going through our career readiness training program, we're looking at what are the strengths this person brings to the table? What are some good opportunities we can go after? And to find those opportunities, we do a lot of research. We go on LinkedIn, we look at other people who do the job, we look at a day in the life videos of people. We look at, what are the requirements for the job versus what are desired skills for the job. Obviously, people with autism, again, see things very literally. So if someone says on a job description, excellent written and verbal communication, most people with autism, most people with ADHD would look at that and say, whoa, 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 that's not who I am. That's not the skills that I have. And so we really kind of need to think through that a little bit more. And as you're supporting someone who is looking for a job, to look at that list and say, obviously this one says it's a plus or it's desired. So this is not a required skill. Really thinking through what is required and making sure that at least most of the items on that list are aligned with the job candidate. And, when also looking at writing those job descriptions, some things that employers can do is really be honest and real about what it is that a person would actually be doing on a job versus adding all that extra fluff that employers add, that HR people add, being able to do 5 things is usually the most, comprehensive list. Everything else beyond that list is you're going to be gaining experience in these things, or you're going to be helping someone else do these things, but you might not be responsible for all of those things. So one thing that, workplaces can do that's really important is to be honest, make sure that their interview processes are not sort of asking people to answer vague questions that are just about random things, but being able to really demonstrate what you would be able to do on the job. One thing that we consult employers to do is to set up a project or an assignment that the job candidate would have to complete in order to demonstrate that they have the skills and abilities to do the job that they are being hired to do. And instead of asking situational questions or asking super open-ended questions that are incredibly challenging for neurodivergent people to answer, being more specific and saying, let's talk about a situation that might happen in this workplace. Oftentimes, this is how our teams work. This is how our project assignment works. Let's imagine this situation happens. How might you handle this? Can you walk me through the steps that you would take or what you might think about in that situation? Asking a question like that versus saying, tell me a situation in which you had to handle a conflict is 2 very different ways of asking questions. So really updating those job descriptions, to be more specific, tailoring the interview process to be more inclusive, and making sure that you're not sort of putting someone on the spot, but you're giving them the accommodations that they need. Some neurodivergent people might also need additional time to interview, or they might have preferences versus interviewing in person versus interviewing virtually. And having flexibility around those kinds of things is very important. So for example, I had a client who had an interview where they were randomly, doing like a rapid fire round of questions, and he only had 1 minute to answer each question. And for someone with autism, that is incredibly challenging. And when you put someone in that place, in that position, you are essentially setting them up to fail. And a lot of times they don't get into those job opportunities specifically because of how the interview is designed. There's a question here on how a physical workplace design can contribute to the inclusion and comfort of neurodiverse employees. I did mention this a little bit earlier in terms of sensory sensitivities, but I will like to say every person is different, so it's impossible to physically design a workspace that works for everyone, but having choice is helpful. For a lot of people, we have this ancestral sort of thing where when things are moving behind us, we spend part of our brain, processing what's going behind us so that we can make sure we know what's happening. It's almost like a survival technique. But a lot of people with autism are not able to work in kind of an open space office, and they need their back towards a wall or some kind of a thing where they don't have to spend time processing what's going on behind them. This is actually also true for people who've gone through trauma, people who have PTSD. Some people can work with music on, some people cannot work with music on, some people are totally fine with background noise, so they're able to work in like a coffee shop setting or a setting where you can hear people talking. Some people are not at all okay with any kind of noise. I know students who like to work in complete silence as well. So it's impossible to fully design a physical workspace for someone with autism or for someone who's neurodiverse or neurodivergent. But you can certainly have some flexibilities. You can have conference rooms in an office where people can go work on their own. You can give people headphones so they can work silently, or they can have music on. You can have places where people are allowed to talk, so a little bit more conversational working area, where people could be collaborating on projects together. These are all different things that you can think about in terms of a physical workspace. One of the biggest issues that neurodivergent people have is that they don't always know what their needs are, what their preferences are. And sometimes it can be really challenging for them when they enter a workplace. And for example, this has happened to me. I'm a neurodivergent person also. I have ADHD. When I first found out I had ADHD, I went to my manager and I told her I had ADHD, and she said, "Do you know what you need?" And I basically said, "I don't." And she didn't know how to help me. And so one of the things that you can do, no matter who you are, whether you're a parent, whether you're a teacher, you're a manager, you're a colleague, you're just someone in the community who knows someone with autism, is that you can help them by bringing up their strengths and also bringing up some of the differences that you've noticed, but not in sort of a way where you're bringing it up to call them out or make them feel bad, but just so that they understand. One of the things that my current workplace and my current colleagues are able to do for me is to say, "Hey, I noticed that in this situation, you seemed a little bit more anxious than in this situation," or "I noticed that you do really well in these types of settings," or "When I give you these types of projects, it's like you're just on it right away. However, with these certain types of tasks, I feel like you have a little bit more difficulty. So you should figure out, what it is that you can improve on in that area." And obviously, for that to work, we all have to be good at giving feedback, as well as for the other party being good at taking feedback. But being able to understand yourself, being able to assert your needs, being able to say, I work best when, this is what I need to focus. I would prefer to have notes after the meeting, or please send me the assignments via email. These are all some types of things that you can think about. In terms of employers, being able to foster an inclusive environment, the biggest thing that they can do is have a mindset of including people for their abilities and accepting for them for their differences. And what that means is, when you see something that doesn't make sense, or you see someone act in a way that's a little bit different than you were expecting, just not to jump to conclusions. We like to talk about how we wear these glasses every single day of expectations and of judgment. And we kind of walk around with those lenses all day long. And a really simple thing we can do is to choose to take those glasses off and to intentionally make the effort to try to understand that person. Give them that mindset of compassionate curiosity, where you can have compassion for their experience and be curious about why something is happening a certain way. And then from that point, creating pathways to including them, saying, I don't know why we have meetings this way. Maybe we could change it. Or, we've been interviewing people this way all this time throughout society. We can certainly make a couple of alterations and make a couple of tweaks to make sure that someone else feels more comfortable in this process. And these are just some of the simple things that employers can do to foster an inclusive workplace. Additionally, connecting with neurodivergent people, getting trainings for awareness sessions, workshops on understanding how to include neurodivergent people is something that we can definitely make some important strides on. A lot of people will say, there's a lot of great things happening in diversity and inclusion, but unfortunately, still to this day, a lot of diversity and inclusion efforts don't always specify disability as an identity that they have identified, outcome goals towards, or basically DEI initiatives in regards to. And that's something that we really need to change as a society. We all kind of walk around, thinking that we are a certain way and judging people for who they are and having expectations of people. But when we take off those lenses and instead replace them with including people for abilities and accepting them for their differences, and fully believing that neurodiversity is a normal part of life, a normal part of our society, neurodivergent people are in every arena of life. They're already in every workplace. They're already in every school. Then we can sort of start to, decide to look at things a little bit differently, and having that aha moment to say, you know what, I'm not going to make, a big judgment, like a quick judgment about someone as soon as I meet them. I'm going to instead try to understand where they're coming from. I'm going to listen to them. I'm going to work with them. I'm going to collaborate with them. And I'm going to empower them so that their strengths can shine. A lot of times neurodivergent people will enter the workplace, like I mentioned before, maybe not knowing fully who they are, or not knowing fully how to understand their needs, or even how to communicate about them. But as long as you have that mindset of compassion for that person, and you're sort of intentionally trying to understand them, then you're sort of creating these amazing pathways for people to find employment, but also for there to be more diversity in the workplace. One of my colleagues in my workplace, who is actually autistic, he lets us know that if he's doodling, he's actually listening to us. But if he's making eye contact with us, he is probably not understanding what we're saying, and he's probably also not listening. But him being able to say those words to us helps us so that we know when we maybe need to take a break, or when we need to sort of, have a conversation at a different time so that we can have better focus and more understanding from him. But these are simple things that we can do in order to just make sure that the workplace is inclusive. There's a lot of different ways that accommodations can show up in the workplace. Some people might ask that they work virtually, or some people might ask that they have a day where they don't have any meetings or interruptions because they need time to do focused work. Some people might need more check-ins with their manager or more feedback. A lot of times the way our workplaces are set up, we might have maybe a one-on-one meeting once a month, and maybe a neurodivergent person needs more check-ins and more feedback from their manager. One thing that helps with executive functioning for neurodiversity is asking for examples of things. So one thing that I ask my manager is, to basically say that I need an example for things so that I know how to work on things. I know how to get things done. I might ask him what tone an email should have. And these are the kinds of questions that I am able to ask my manager because I work in a neuro-inclusive team. So, we're almost coming towards the end of this session. I do want to say, if you would like to learn a lot more about the things that I've touched on today, please buy a copy of Neurodiversity for Dummies, which is co-authored by myself and my two colleagues. This book is helpful for teachers, for parents, for colleagues, for managers, generally people in society and our world at large. We wrote this book because we wanted to further our understanding of neurodiversity and basically create a more neuro-inclusive and neuro-affirming world. We obviously have our online career readiness training at Neurodiversity Pathways, which is fully focused on preparing neurodivergent adults with the workplace readiness skills, with the career readiness skills to get into the workplace. And we also have a lot of trainings for companies, such as awareness trainings. We have workshops as well on different things like recruitment and hiring, communications, inclusive meetings, how to do disclosure and accommodations, as well as self-advocacy. And we do a number of different workshops that are available to people, to companies, no matter what their size is, whether they're larger corporations or smaller nonprofits. We've even started working with school districts, with schools, as well as government agencies. I think that, I'm just going to sort of end with my mission here, which is to intentionally create spaces where neurodistinct individuals can be included. I think we all deserve the right to feel empowered, to thrive, whether no matter what environment we're in, but especially in our workplaces. And a huge gap in the services that we provide to people with autism, to people with ADHD and dyslexia, so on and so forth, is that while we do have a lot of services for children and young adults, we sort of kind of forget about them once they reach adult age. Here in America, after the age of 26, it's much harder to get services. It's much harder to get supports. It's much harder to find, you know, programs that can support employment. And so we are doing our part. We're just a 3-person team all the way here in California. And we're doing our part here to sort of make sure that we can do our part in supporting neurodivergent people to feel empowered, to learn about themselves, to feel confident enough to advocate for themselves in any workplace that they go to. And then also, on the other hand, empowering companies and leaders and HR teams and management teams to be able to support those neurodivergent people in the workplace. I think it's really important that we work on both sides of these equation. We need government agencies to step in. We need leaders to step in and create more incentives for companies, for startups, for nonprofits to create more jobs that are inclusive, and also to create more recruitment and hiring practices that don't just look at people through some strong, rigid, way of looking at things, and making sure that we're sort of being flexible and understanding and changing things a little bit so that we can include people with disabilities, we can include people with autism, and so that we can include them in ways that they can really feel that they belong, that their strengths can shine, and we can empower them to bring their whole selves to the workplace and not have to mask, not have to hide who they are, and authentically be themselves. I'm able to take any more questions if anyone has them, but thank you so much for making the time. And I really appreciate being able to speak to you all. I kind of feel like I rushed through a lot of information here. If you would like to connect with me, I believe that my links to my social media will be shared to my LinkedIn page, to my Facebook, to my Instagram. Again, you can buy a copy of our book on Amazon. You can learn more about neurodiversity pathways on our website at ndpathways.org. And we will be starting our next cohort for the students, for the job seekers, mid-August. And we would look forward to speaking with you and telling you more about who we are and what it is that we do. So thank you so much. And I will pause here. And if there's any other questions, I'm happy to answer. Sounds good. Looks like we're waiting for questions to come in. Yeah, I see some questions here that I didn't get to earlier. But I was going to say, for employers to foster an inclusive workplace culture, really making sure that you have the readiness to empower people and accept people for who they are without trying to change them to fit into a rubric that you might have set for your workplace. In terms of really getting some training in place so that everyone within the organization can be aware of what autism is, what people with autism work like, what some of their differences are, and what are some of the amazing strengths that they bring to the table. Another question here that was asked was what social and team building activities can be inclusive of neurodiverse individuals? For this question, going back to compassionate curiosity, I would just say to ask, what team building activities, or if we were to do this activity, would you be comfortable with that? Kind of asking the people who do have autism and who have disclosed their autism, what they're comfortable with is a great place to start, because every person with autism is completely unique. And we can't make any assumptions between one person to the next, because someone with autism who might be really social and really talkative is very different than someone with autism who is kind of curt and is not as verbose. So being able to ask, like, I think the more that we can ask people where they are, the better we can do in terms of creating more inclusive workplaces and really making sure that people feel comfortable to bring their whole selves to the workplace, to the school, in whatever environment that it is that we're talking about. Okay, I'm trying to see if there's any other questions. Okay. All right. No more questions. All right. Thank you, guys. It was so nice to speak with you. Please do connect with me. And I really, really appreciate speaking to you all. I know that we're all coming from sort of different places of understanding in different parts of the world. I hope that we can all do our part in being more inclusive and creating more belonging and just supporting neurodivergent people with our whole hearts. Thank you so much and have a good one.